Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. So today we have with us Iona Lawrence, and she is a freelance strategist and campaigner and helps out charities and non-profit organisations around the country. In 2016, Iona set up the Jo Cox Foundation in memory of her friend, Jo Cox MP. So through which she campaigned to appoint the world's first Minister for Loneliness. And this year, in 2003, Iona has been able to complete her Churchill Fellowship, which consisted of a couple of months travelling across Austria, Germany, Italy and the Netherlands, meeting intergenerational activists and change makers just to better understand what more can be done in the UK to boost and bolster intergenerational connections. And she'll be sharing all of her experiences with us today. Hiya. Iona.
Quite finished introducing. Hi everyone, and hi everyone online. It's nice to be with you, and thank you for having me. It's really kind. As Becky said, I had the pleasure of spending 2 months interrating around Europe for some research purposes, but it also felt a lot like a holiday, not just because I was eating and seeing delicious things, but also because I was spending some time with some really wonderful people. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to run you through a few of the things that I did, why I did it, and some things that I'm taking away from it. And I don't know why you decided to share an hour of your time with me. You've been forced to or whatever. But I hope that it might leave those of you who are particularly involved in the intergenerational work that the team is doing, that some of you are doing, sure that it's extremely valuable and that it's more valuable than ever before, even though this sort of work isn't, as in my opinion, as much of a priority as it needs to be across civil society, public services and government. So the reason I came, and also the other thing I'm going to give you at the very end is a précis of what the Churchill Fellowship is, because it might be interesting to you. I don't know if you're aware of it, but I'll explain a bit what it is in case it's something you want to apply for. So the reason I came to intergenerational practice, which, just for the absence of doubt, you guys are probably better at definitions than I am, is, in my opinion, anything that just brings together and boosts and creates the opportunity for social connection between people of different generations. And all too often we think, oh, that's like that thing on the telly, the old people care home with young people on Channel 4 that was a few years ago. And of course, that's a really important part of it. But my interest is much broader than that, because I think that that's one part of a much bigger set of things that are needed in order to build and bolster intergenerational connection. And the reason I am interested in this area is partly because, as Becky said in the introduction, I did a lot of work in the memory of the MP Jo Cox, who was killed in 2016, on loneliness and social isolation, and how that relates not just to our health and the strength of our communities, but also to our politics and how it's underpinned by economic drivers as much as social ones. And in case you haven't read it, I think there's no better starting point maybe for the data than this book by Bobby Duffy, who is an academic at King's, I think. And in this book, Generations, that was published a couple of years ago, he set out on a quest to understand whether or not the sort of intergenerational conflict that takes up so much space in our headlines and other things is rooted in reality, and whether generations really are at war with each other, or whether it is just a natural part of society with different ages in it, and what is driving perceived disconnections or conflict. So he did this great book, and I kind of feel like I don't need to share the some of the data with you on this, but in case you're not part of the core iGen team, social disconnection is obviously underpinned by economics, and there's loads of different data on this, but home ownership for young people in the UK has halved since the 1980s, with older people owning more wealth than their younger counterparts. And there's versions of that for everything from employment to access to services. But also the thing that kind of gets me, and the thing that really got Jo Cox when she was building her work around loneliness before she was killed, was the fact that it's all too easy for us to live side by side and seldom interact. In fact, maybe not even live side by side and seldom and interact ever. And so we are now less likely at this moment in time to have any sort of relationship with someone who is outside of our family and a different generation than at any point in history where data has been calculated. And of course, whether it's cause or effect, I'm not here to say, we know that the way in which we not only have different economic realities and are interacting less and less, the ways in which we are doing things like voting, for instance, on anything from Brexit to general elections, is reflecting these sort of wider cleavages in who we are and what we value, and that then in perhaps politics and the media is being cooked up as this great big storm. So the thing that I set out to do, and it was 4 years ago that I first put pen to paper on this, but then COVID came along and I couldn't travel anywhere, was basically go out in search of stuff that isn't just old people in care homes and school kids coming together for really brilliant and important music classes and regular interaction, but actually all the different ways in which generations can be brought together as a kind of normal, everyday part of life. And there are lots of seeds of this in the UK, obviously. I'm sure you've all got your own version, but there's an organisation that I love called Grand Nanny that's trying to fix the way in which older people looking for work could play a part in childcare as in paid capacity, but there's no like matchmaking service, so they're doing basically a nannying service, but with nannies being in their 50s, 60s and 70s. There was, until last week or the week before, a brilliant pioneering organisation called the Cares Family that brought together sort of young professionals and older people in big cities where gentrification is throwing people around a lot and doesn't necessarily mean that these two groups get to mix much. But sadly they have closed, and it might be interesting for us to come back to what that tells you about the context in which you're operating with your IGEN work. But I was like, there's got to be so much more than this. And one of my big frustrations as I try and fundraise for work like care home fans, which I know that you've done some work with, is that funders, philanthropy organisations, as much as government funders, will be like, oh, that intergenerational work, it doesn't work. We know it doesn't last. It only lasts for as long as a project lasts. And so I was I was sort of drawn to wanting to research and look at other ideas, because not just because we need more ideas, but also other ideas might help us build the evidence base for what really works in terms of intergenerational work. So I picked a really arduous route across Europe that started with a month in Sicily, and I really can't recommend that more as a life experience. And I went to Sicily because, as you probably know, there's lots of migration away from rural Sicily to the bigger cities, leaving populations in quite heavily aging and in towns where people can't afford to keep the houses up anymore. I went to Vienna because there's just loads of intergenerational stuff there, and I was like, why is that going on? I went to Heidelberg because someone connected me to someone who connected me to someone who was in Heidelberg, and I went to the Netherlands because Ellie Robinson-Carter, who's part of this team, but also online, I think, somewhere, has a friend there who works in a care home called Humanitas. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to walk you through a few stories that sort of move me, and I feel a bit strange presenting things to academics, because really my version of rigor here is nothing compared to what you have. But there are 5 stories that I think might bring them to light the kinds of things that I saw and learned and reflected on, and then I'm going to talk about a few patterns, and then we can have a chance for questions. So in Sicily, in this town called Musamelli, which if you put your finger right in the middle of Sicily, you have this town that has an old town that's full of houses that are being sold off for €1, which you might have seen in the news or on the telly. And there's a guy called Danny, and Danny is an Aussie come by London who worked for Jamie Oliver for a few years, and he came up for retirement and was like, I don't want to retire in the UK, I'm going to go to Sicily and buy myself one of these €1 houses. Anyway, he did a few years ago, and in the process of buying a house and setting himself up in this community where the mayor is playing a really big role in trying to revitalise a kind of slightly depleted local community and population. He identified this big need for social infrastructure. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with that term, maybe if physical infrastructure is built, like roads and parks and bridges, social infrastructure is the stuff that builds the social fabric of a place. So it might be parks or libraries or communities, and in somewhere like Sicily, it's traditionally very church-based. But like in Sicily, like in lots of places, the role of the church is declining. And he was like, what would it take to create a new piece of social infrastructure in the heart of Mussomeli that is for the local people of the town? And he's a sort of example of someone who didn't set out being like, I'm going to go and do some intergenerational work. Not many people really say that. And he just was like, I think there's something to be done here. And who you can see in this photo is this is an older lady called Kalodra, and she's in her 70s. She's a retired pasticceria chef. And she's just one of the many local people who were presented with this space, basically, to do whatever she wanted it. And she was like, oh, if I can do anything I want, I'd love to work with the kids and do cooking classes after school. And so each day there's a kind of program of activities, each of them led by people within the town, and all of which add up to something that really is very unique, because this is a place where the use of cars is very, very strong, because everyone is very rural, so people are driving in and out of town the whole time. So town squares that might once have been places you loitered, basically being turned into car parks. And what he's done is, like, at quite low rent, got a space on the square, and then instead of saying I'm going to deliver a service, he said I'm going to create space for people to do whatever it is they want. And overall, what you've ended up with is something that feels quite unlikely. An Aussie who doesn't really speak brilliant Italian, running a community centre for the people of this town in the middle of nowhere. And it really challenged my assumptions on a few things. Like, people often think in this space that lived experience or local leadership is best, which of course in this case it's really important. But also Danny, to quote a local lady, she said, there's no way any of us would have seen the possibility for this. Like, it's like, this is something that we'd have, like, heard from one of our peers and been like, oh, what a stupid idea. And then Danny came along and we were like, why not? So it sort of challenged lots of my expectations, but including about where good leadership comes from. This, you're not meant to have favourites, but this is my favourite. And if I could deploy the identi to understand what it is about this and the context that makes this so amazing, I'd love to. So in Vienna, there is an organisation called Wohnbuddy, which connects young people looking for cheap rent with older people with spare houses. And we have that sort of work in the UK. Shared Lives Plus is an example of that kind of work. But the super interesting thing here is that care homes often have corridors where most of the rooms are single occupancy, but there'll be some double, because sometimes couples move in. But lots of those are empty. And so a few years ago, they decided they wanted to go and see if it was possible to place young people in here. And this couple here, so Hadil is my friend in the middle, who was just helping me for a week. But on the left and the right is Imad on the left and Charlotte on the right. And they, about 3.5 years ago, moved into a care home, into one of these double rooms, for really cheap rent. And in exchange for it, they give 20 hours of voluntary support a month, which is mostly playing board games with people with dementia. I don't even know where to begin to describe the kind of profoundness and also totally normalness of this whole experience for them both. But they were obviously there during COVID, which was, I think, a really challenging but also extraordinary time to be there. They, as you will all have your own experiences of, there were kind of staff shortages at different points, so they found themselves putting hazmat suits on and changing beds in COVID wards and those sorts of things. But when asked, like, you know, they're both students, one's doing a master's and one's finishing their undergrad, and Imad actually only arrived as a refugee from Syria about 5 years ago, so like, they've got their own kind of quite circuitous roots to this moment in time. But when asked, like, why it is they live here of all places, they were like, well, obviously there's the money, but there's also the fact that, like, Charlotte spoke a bit about her mental health and how she has mental health challenges, and that but that living in this kind of engine room of connection, where if she can get out of bed one day and feel a bit rough, but go downstairs and like plug into the like mainframe of all of the community that is happening down there, she says it's like it keeps her sane and happy and healthy. And it really challenged my expectations about what's possible, because it's, at least in my experience in the UK, this sort of setup, you know, they haven't been particularly trained for any of this. They're just, their invitation is to be good neighbours to the older people that they live alongside. They are not health or social care like students or anything. And it feels to me that this feels quite far away from what might be possible in the UK, regarding in particular our relationship to risk and regulation, and that this might be deemed quite a high risk kind of setup really to have. Then also in Vienna, I love this. This is a cafe that is co-run by people in their 60s, 70s and 80s and people in their 20s and 30s. And it's not a voluntary project. Everyone's paid the same. They're all paid a wage. They go in. Older people want to do the work because they've got small pensions and they need to top them up. And younger people, because like all young people arriving in big cities, they want to make some money as they work out their kind of career path. I don't know if anyone's been to Vienna, but like traditionally, their kind of social spaces and their cafes, these quite austere, grand places where you're like slightly bullied by a waiter and you're like moved on quite quickly. And they tried to not just create a space for old and young to encounter each other and build relationships, but also to kind of subvert what it takes to create meaningful social infrastructure in Vienna. And it was super interesting. One of the things I took away from this is when I was talking to the manager of this cafe, and there were now 3 of them across Vienna, and they have big plans to scale. The manager said, you know, it's not my job to keep these vulnerable old people safe from these, like, you know, reckless young people. He's like, they're all adults. We obviously have to create conditions in which they can all work well together. And sometimes that does mean I need to step in and support some conflict management, whatever it is. But a lot of the time, we just trust people to get on with stuff together. And I'll come back to what that left me feeling about the UK in a bit, but it definitely feels like, again, we don't really see this except where it might be by mistake and unintentionally older and young people start working alongside each other. Nothing this deliberate would happen in the UK, and certainly not one that assumes that 60, 70-year-olds would have anything necessarily to contribute to a cafe of this style. And then the final thing is, this is the penultimate thing. So this, in the middle here, this blue shirt, this guy with the white hair, he is a guy called Ingo, and he set up a distributed care network across Heidelberg, which is a quite small university town in Germany. And his idea is that basically there should be space for care between the family unit and services, and that people with anything from mental health needs to disabilities can and should be given the opportunity to live alongside other citizens, for opportunities for like mutual support. So you might have medical students living in a shared house alongside people with some complex needs, whether it's mental or physical, as well as just like, you know, older people who have a bit more time or whatever it is. And they own a handful of houses, and across those houses, these small care communities. It was really interesting to see, and it felt like very, both quite, it just felt like a glimpse of what might be required in like demographically aging like populations where you're going to have much more complex needs that the health system can't support. They definitely haven't nailed what it takes to manage that without Ingo basically not sleeping, because every time something goes wrong, his mobile phone goes. But it was beautiful and hopeful and very interesting to like think about the health side of things. And then a quick note about the Eisner Foundation. If you don't know, they're basically, as far as we think, those of us who think about these things, we think they're the only dedicated funder philanthropic funder for intergenerational work in the world. And they, relative to US standards, don't have that much money. I think they give about 10 million quid away a year. But what they're able to do, having committed for the long run to genuine intergenerational work, is they're able to kind of catalyse wider interest and support for the work. So they've definitely played a big role in a like ascendant policy agenda and creating a sense that this is a kind of favourable place to operate if you're in civil society or health services. And so, yes, thinking back to the UK, we have like nothing like that in the UK, and I'm sure the iGen team will have their own version of the stories that I have around. Yeah, as I said earlier, calling people up and saying, do you fund intergenerational work? And they say, no, it's rubbish. So, a few quick conclusions or like emerging conclusions before I think about recommendations. So like loneliness is a really massive and growing social challenge, and I don't believe, unlike some people in the world, that you can sort of end it. I think it's innate to the human condition, but there's lots of things about the way we live, work and play, which we could talk about if we wanted to. That means that we are experiencing it more, and that those of us who are experiencing it aren't just people who might stereotypically be seen to be experiencing it. And that like COVID has left this like deep like indentation, I think, on everyone. Everyone I spoke to had stories about isolated people in their lives who'd really suffered under COVID, dementia that had been expedited, community spaces that had been lost. Like all of the challenges are the same, although different in flavour across the whole of Europe. This is a photo here of the kitchen in Sicily, and whether it was in Sicily or Vienna, there's loads of really great and important local new social infrastructure bubbling up, and I think some of that is a response to COVID. And I think it's also a response to like uncertainty. A lot of the people would say, well, you know, I see this need in my community around preparing for floods in northern Italy, or dealing with cost of living crises and needing to provide meals for people in communities, and that like these are spaces and places for people to like find meaning and belonging and action. A lot of the kind of frontier of this work is happening on the like, how do we live under the same roof as each other? Because it's strange, like Sicily has so much vacant housing, but lots of it is unlivable in. And then you go to Vienna and everyone's being priced out like they are in places in the kind of larger cities in the UK, and also the towns as well. And so people everywhere are like asking, like, what would it look like to live together, and not in a way that returns to communes or multi-generational houses that don't meet our needs, but something that's much more fit for a time where people recognise there's not enough space and that housing is expensive to get our hands on. And that leadership, this is lovely Danny in his kitchen. Like, he looks so unlikely as a guy to like lead this like incredible social space. And as I say, if anyone speaks Italian, apparently that Italian doesn't make any sense. He just Google translates and then writes on a whiteboard every Sunday for his community meals. So yes, we must challenge ourselves about what good leadership looks like for intergenerational work. And then finally, this slide is just, I left thinking like, this is all so obvious. Lots of what I've seen is so obvious. But yet, why does so much of it not happen in the UK organically, or in a way that I would hope it might be organically? So, a few thoughts. I arranged my conclusions around people who basically give funding and people who receive funding, and so it's a bit rudimentary. But as we were talking about iGen work this morning, I was like, we're all just swimming in the same stuff here. We've all got the same challenges, whether or not you're specifically working in the academic space. But funding where it is available for intergenerational work, and when we say intergenerational work, I mean stuff that's truly reciprocal, that attends to what good outcomes look like for people of all ages, like different ages. And that all too often funding in this space is like, you can have money for a club for a year, or we'll give you money to have a policy group for 18 months, but nothing that's long enough to really create like systems change or change the soul of the system, as a guy called David Robinson says. And that all too often people see intergenerational work as this quite sort of old and young coming together, and that is not fit for purpose if we really think about the kind of scale of the intergenerational challenges we're experiencing. I came away just really sure that the charity sector is underpinned by a set of structures that aren't really fit for purpose if we genuinely want to build intergenerational connection. How many of you have worked a lot with charity funding, but I think it's similar to public sector funding. It often says you need to have a volunteer group and a beneficiary group. That beneficiary group needs to be protected and that volunteer group needs to be trained. And yes, if you want to bring them all together to have a nice social club, that's fine. But beforehand, you're going to have DBS checked some of them and not others of them. You're going to have trained some of them and not others of them. And then that just means when you get everyone into a room, unlike the cafe in Vienna where everyone's like, oh, you're a new employee, let me induct you and show you how it works around here. You're creating a lack of parity in the way that they're connecting from the first go, and that definitely impacts their relationships longer term. And that the scale of the loneliness crisis means that people want to be like, what does a big top-down program look like? And everything I witnessed was strength in human scale. None of us are like, I'm sure if we've all got perhaps older relatives or friends, you know, people don't want a massive program come along and be like, you look like you're in the lonely bracket, let's give you a befriending intervention. Like, we all want human-sized kind of connections to get our hands around. And so ambition doesn't have to mean scaling. And I think if we go back to this example of the Cares family, which was, in my opinion, like the leading intergenerational pioneer, that they closed after a period of really relentless 12 years of just like growth, calls into question one of the many things, which is whether or not scale of ideas and interventions is necessarily what is going to be most effective. Yeah, I think those two at the end aren't so important because we're aware of time. And these are broadly the same, but angled at civil society organisations. Yes, people must, if you were running a programme or an organisation, you want to be careful about scale. You want to be careful about creating these kind of rudimentary groups where people are insiders and outsiders or have more power than the other. And that we need to work collaboratively, and that's sort of a message for people who aren't really in this room, but there are various new efforts to build infrastructure and membership organisations in this space that are in some way competing, and isn't probably that helpful when there's not enough money to get around anyway. So all of that is to say, before I move on to this, I remain clearer at the end of this than I did beforehand, that intergenerational work as something that's important for health and social outcomes as much as it is for community cohesion and social integration stuff, is more important than ever before, and all too often is seen to be the kind of nice, frilly stuff after you've attended to the more important social integration issues like faith and race and ethnicity and class, which are all important, but we know that in an intersectional framing that age runs into all of those other cleavages, and yet all too often it's deemed to be the thing that's not quite so important and should just be done once you've thought about everything else, and it should probably just look like a nice music group in a care home. And it left me, I'm feeling quite bleak, because I think I've said a few times about the state of this work in a health system that doesn't want to attend to social needs because it can't even attend to the more pressing physical or mental ones, even though we know that all of those things are reliant on one another. And then in a civil society that currently, if you were running an organisation that worked on loneliness or intergenerational work 3 years ago, you could fight people off for money and attention, and that lots of people have left the building on funding this sort of work. Which is why I really think that the iGen work is so vital. The work that you're doing to understand the evidence better is not the only, but it's a significant part of what it will take to engage funders in the medium to long term in an issue like this or to give civil society organisations the confidence that they want to engage in this sort of work. And so, I came away just sure that, you are doing brilliant work. A quick note on the Churchill Fellowship, which is the absolute dream, and I can't recommend it more. Basically, it's not Churchill's money. It was an endowment set up in his memory, and every year they send 150 people away, anywhere in the world they want, to explore a social or environmental issue of their interest. And there are 10 sort of subcategories, which are their priorities, so you should take a look at those. But the idea is it's specifically for people who are focused. They're often practitioners, so they aren't looking for people with really strong academic skills. Then this is an opportunity for people who might be working at the front line of public services or in leadership roles in charities or anywhere in society. They send people overseas to have a look at anything from how you diversify the construction industry to how you bring play into the front line of the health system. And you get the application process is really quite fast because they've got thousands of applicants and they're only going to get 150, so you have this really harsh form where you get tell us your idea in 10 words, and 10 words. And then if you get shortlisted, you're sent to an interview that's only 15 minutes. You're sitting there in this scary building in Westminster and they're bearing down on you and you've got no idea whether or not they like you or not. But I think it's an amazing opportunity if you think you've got a hunch about something but you don't have the space to explore it in a meaningful way. And also if you think a bit of breathing room in your day-to-day job is would benefit you. So particularly for you or other people who might feel like they've been in a job or in a project for a number of years, and you're just I'm pretty sure there's stuff outside of this that I could be inspired by, but I don't know where to begin to get the breathing room. This kind of opportunity is amazing, and in my experience, pretty unique and rare. So if you were interested, I'd be happy to share with you my application because it worked for me and it might give you some ideas about yours. But a few things that I learned along the way from my own application and others is that they've funded people for the last 30 years or something. So there'll be people who've done similar things to your idea already. So you should have a look at those, and they're all on their website. They love practical things. So they're quite an old-fashioned bunch. And they're we like doers. We don't want thinkers. It's okay, we need both, but whatever. So yes, if you were to think about applying, drawing on, any experience you have in practice rather than your academic background would be good. They also really like people who can get stuff done. So you get given a portion of money. I think I got $5,000, and that money doesn't really cover lost its earnings. It's designed just to cover your travel. So it's a challenge in that way that you can then just divide your travel up into chunks if that's what you need to do. But you're just given the money and told to write a report when you're back. So you're not given loads of support while you're on it. So you need to have quite a lot of your own energy. And you should keep your ideas really simple. They have these panels, and those panels have some interest in an area and some expertise, but not loads. So I have to boil my ideas right down into really quite simple, normal human terms. And they want to know that you're the sort of person who can, persuade people like Becky to be yeah, sure, come spend a day with the team, because they don't want you to just learn some stuff and not share it. They want you to share it and use it in a way that's going to benefit relationships and networks. And the process is intimidating. I've spoken to a few people who basically melted at the interview stage because you're in this scary room in Westminster with loads of peers in the House of Lords asking you all of these quite scary questions and making you not feel very good about yourself. So if you're someone who for whom that sort of thing is intimidating, which is I think most of us, don't feel intimidated by it. They have given money to all sorts of different people, and it's not for people who don't feel comfortable in those spaces. Because the application process at the first instance is really, really simple, I would encourage you to give it a go if it seems remotely interesting. So yeah, that's all I really have to say, and I wondered if we wanted to have a bit of chat about that, if there was anything that anyone thought about, anything that they didn't agree with, or wanted to hear more about any of those particular stories. it's all written up on my website, but mostly it's like photos. So like I try to, no offense to you because you're all brilliant writers, but I don't know if the world needed another PDF report. So it's not a PDF report, it's just a few pages on my website with lots of pictures and quotes and those sorts of things. So you can read more about it online. But thanks for listening.
Thank you, Iona. That was really, really great to hear all about your experiences doing the Churchill Fellowship, but also applying for it. Does anybody have any questions, either in the room or online? Oh, Moana, go on, go for it.
About the Vol pension cafes, which sound like a really, really simple idea. What are the obstacles to stop it happening here then? I mean, I was thinking, you mentioned that they kind of do it deliberately, it's a deliberate thing, so they'll only hire people of a certain age. Would there be issues, like legal issues here? Would people claim that it's discriminatory?
Yeah, I actually don't know if they say specifically that you can't hire people in between the kind of younger and an older audience. I think but yeah, I presume that would be a barrier, likely in Vienna as much as it would be here. I think some of the barriers might be around expectations of like workforce. So a lot of what they have to manage quite carefully is the idea that these are people who are working alongside each other and have lots to bring, but there'll be stuff that different groups can't do because of their background, and that's a faff, right? Like, I don't know if anyone's worked in hospitality ever / recently, but like it's not the kind of place where you're like, oh, let's wait for the person who takes longer to make the cup of tea. Like, it's a resource-strapped, very high-stress context, and you're wanting to save costs. So one of the things that they have had to do is match or pair their income revenue, like their trading revenue, with philanthropic funding, because there are what other people would deem inefficiencies in their business model that mean that they have to have more people on the shop floor than you might have if you had a slightly different workforce. They would see that as a strength, and there are loads of positive outcomes, but like it's not naturally incentivized in the hospitality industry, I think. So that would be like one of the ways. I think also, like, I don't know, there's just a sense that like maybe, yeah, we don't even know that that's not, like, you know, it felt very confounding and like unnormative to sit and be served coffee and cake by like such a, like, I mean, we obviously do have older workforce here. I'm not saying that we don't, but it was just so deliberately and carefully done in a way that was combined that was the kind of astounding thing. And then also at a scale at which, again, you might have a cafe here, one cafe that might have an intergenerational element to it, but so deliberately to say, you know, this is our objective, is quite different. And it was anecdotal, but speaking to the people that I met on the street and other things, they'd be like, oh, if that's what you're interested in, you're going to Vol Pension. Like, it's definitely become a bit of a landmark and something that like people in Vienna are like, oh, this is a different experience to what you get in other places, and that is not preferable to other things, but it's unique. So yeah, that would be my sense, but I don't know if that would be fair or if anyone else would disagree.
We have had a question come in on the chat from Esra Hassan, who says, thanks, really fab. I was just wondering if we know of any intergenerational initiatives between adolescents, secondary schools, and older adults that is not care homes. As you said, traditionally, we think of children and care home initiatives, but I was just struggling to think what else is going on with teenagers and older adults that schools get involved in, if anyone knows of any.
So there's an organisation that Ellie Robinson-Carter and I have both done some work with, and Ellie's online and works with the iGen projects I think I mentioned earlier. And the linking network is Bradford-based, and it was set up in the wake of the Bradford riots in 2000 and I can't remember. And it was set up by some teachers who were really aware that the conversations going on in classrooms in a kind of, because the education system is quite segregated often, the conversations going on in classrooms about the Bradford riots in the wake of them weren't necessarily representative of all the views of the communities in Bradford, because you only have certain communities represented in different classrooms. And so it connects different schools together. So that is at primary and secondary, for these sort of, not just like one-off, like, let's go to the museum and like laugh at the weirdos that we don't know, but these like year-long deep engagements where you basically make friends with a new class, but often in the same neighbourhood, but often quite different to you. And they are just stretching into the intergenerational space. And I think the strength of that is, as the person online said, is that they already have these pre-existing relationships with schools up and down all across England, and at the secondary level, and so it's really very easy for them to connect those into the older person infrastructure, whereas lots of the other initiatives very much focus on primary. So yeah, it might be worth looking at the linking network, but also drop me an email if you want more information.
Lorraine, did you want to give it a go?
It was just a question. I think you partly answered it just now. I was just wondering, given what you said about the charity system in the UK not being very amenable to these kind of projects, which I totally get, having worked in the charity system with all the stuff and it being very risk averse, whether the projects you came across were able to be self-sufficient, or whether they did need to rely on kind of grants and charity and that kind of thing to be able to operate.
So none of them were entirely funded by philanthropy. And all of them were slightly different, but most of them were thinking about like tradable income, as lots of people in the charity sector are needing to now. What can I say that might be a little bit more specific? If you take, I don't know if there is anything other than no one I met thinks that the solution to this is to just get a project fully funded. The interesting thing about somewhere like Sicily is that with quite high unemployment, the voluntary sector is seen to be an entry point for paid employment. And so one of the things that something like the Good Kitchen benefits from are what would be deemed like really quite valuable workforce, like would otherwise be in the workforce, but there aren't jobs available for them at this stage. So like younger people with quite a lot of education, they are bringing their voluntary skills to the kitchen and using it as a way of building their professional experience in the hope that it's a launch pad. And obviously, if you interpret that as like, oh, it's just free labour, it's like not valuable. But if you interpret that as actually that's cost saved, then it's worth making it into the overall model and recognising that in other places it's not going to be possible to have that such high quality labour just like sitting around waiting for like volunteering stuff to do on like, you know, weekdays or basically any time of day. So yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I think similarly we have a massive talent pool of graduates working as baristas. So, yeah. Thank you.
I was going to ask you, Iona, partly about that sustainability. You mentioned in one of the interventions in one of the practices, I think it was in Heidelberg, that it all came down to that one gentleman where he's called up whenever anything goes wrong. To what extent did you see other practices that managed to not end up relying on like one or two key people and that were sustainable in other ways?
I think Danny in Sicily is doing a really good job at that. He is like he's quite a big Instagrammer, so he's like really into his modelling of like life boundaries and things. But if you get below some of that stuff, what he's actually saying is like, I want to create a project that lasts outside of my lifespan, and that, you know, the calibre and the quality of the work he's been involved with before the Jamie Oliver Empire and other bits and pieces, he's seen some of the challenges that happen when people become too integral to the leadership of something. So he's working with 20 and 30 somethings very deliberately to try and create like basically leaders for an organisation that he's not really in charge of now anyway in a traditional sense, but that he could step away from, and but that takes a lot of self-awareness and foresight, and someone like the wonderful Ingo in Heidelberg, he's a man of like incredible service, and he spent his whole life doing this sort of work, and so I don't think he has ever been encouraged or supported to be like, what would it look like if you didn't do this on your own? The sustainability question in terms of leadership is really significant, and the really hard thing and the thing I came away with thinking about for myself is that leadership is all too often expected from older people, perhaps in the UK, retired people, because they literally have time in their week, or some of them do, to dedicate to leading projects or initiatives. I'm holding this question in my head around like, for as long as we're trapped inside that kind of model that dictates that people of different ages mostly just don't have time to prioritise things, partly because of the stresses of anything from caring, parenting, or work, we're going to be limited in like what sustainability actually looks like. And I don't know if Lorraine or other people have thoughts on the charity sector more broadly and how over-reliant we are on decisions taken by trustees, and trustees have voluntary roles, and voluntary roles are like that we are stuck in a model basically that means that sustainability in a leadership sense is all too often the preserve for people who have time, and that is not an equally distributed group of people that is very heavily weighted towards a whole set of existing privileges, which isn't a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily create like true sustainability. And then the sustainability in the like financial sense, the challenge is that people, funders, whether you're commissioning a service or doing a philanthropic intervention, that question, I don't know if you presumably have to answer it on every application form that says, how will this work survive after the lifetime of this grant? And it's probably the most frustrating question on the whole world, really, because it's banal. Like what you're doing there is trying to defer the sustainability to an organisation that's saying very explicitly in its application it needs money to make this thing happen. And so, the kind of financial sustainability model is like a whole set of other challenges, I think, because there are ways in which you can make work have a sustained impact, and there are ways that you can redistribute where the work happens after a funding opportunity is expired. But anyone who thinks that money goes on trees, or things happen on hot air, has got another thing coming, especially if you want to put equity at the heart of what you're doing, because you have to have some form of money in order to create parity in people's engagement. So I don't have an answer to that.
Thank you.